Hello and welcome back to Will, A Wonderful World. I've decided to change it up a bit. From now on, I won't read all of the letters in character voices anymore. I'll read all of them normally, and I'll only switch to a specific voice if there is an actual line of dialogue in there. I think this is better for both my voice and maybe even for viewing pleasure, because the main problem is it started snowing. This might sound completely unrelated, but because it started snowing in Austria, I can now finally go cross-country skiing again. As you may realize or may have noticed before, if you've been watching my videos for a while, is I can't really breathe through my nose very well. That means while cross-country skiing, especially because it's very physically exhausting, I have to breathe through my mouth a lot. Now, last weekend when I was cross-country skiing, it was on average about -8 degrees. So that is not great for my throat and my lungs to do that, and I'd like to not stress them any more than I actually need to. So I'll keep character voices to a minimum at the moment. This might change in the future. If you really want me to do them, I might do it occasionally with certain characters. And just, maybe not do it for the solutions that you get when you try different sort of arrangements for the letters. But yeah, just let me know what you think of this, and maybe I'll change this again in the future, but for now, this is how we're doing it. I've got 2 new letters from Liwen and Carlos. Those are connected, of course, but we'll just do it in order. This is the one we got last, the one we got first, I guess. Unwanted and Shaking Hands, Park Sangun and Chang Yeon-min. Let's go. Oops, let's click the thing below it, of course. I'd finally seen a true marksman today. The custodian who loved soap operas so much that he would bawl his eyes out had averted Lieutenant Kang's crisis with just a toy gun. And it was from such a distance. Forget about being a toy gun. Even with a real gun, it would be incredibly hard to hit the temple of your target. If I'd gone on the mission by myself, everything would have been over by now. I hadn't realized that I couldn't shoot a gun until I enrolled in the police academy. Every time I tried to aim, I couldn't calm down and concentrate. No matter how hard I trained, I couldn't improve my shooting performance. That sounds like you're doing very inefficient training then. The academy even sent me to a specialized psychologist, although we didn't find anything wrong. Unsurprisingly, I got a 0 in my final shooting test. I became the laughingstock of the class. How did he even pass then? I mean, this guy doesn't sound suited to be a police officer that goes out and handles cases. I mean, by all means, he can still, be in the office and handle work there, and maybe work on cases that require less shooting. But for like high danger criminal cases, he sounds completely unsuited. And from what we've seen of him in the past, he is completely unsuited. If it weren't for my outstanding grades in the combat test, convincing the academy to make an exception for me, I would probably still be wasting bullets in training. They shouldn't have made an exception. Guns must simply not agree with me. Yeah, it's definitely the gun's fault. There couldn't be any other explanation. The custodian had gone back to the police station. All we needed to do was wait for the reinforcements from the station and clean up the mess. By the way, even though I wasn't good with them, I could still appreciate guns. I still thought that it would feel great if I could have one with me all the time. That's not a good idea. I was playing with a gun that I had just picked up off the ground. It must have belonged to one of these losers. When I was feeling a little drunk with power in my hands, a stranger walked out of the shadows behind a cargo container. It was a huge muscular man in his 40s or 50s. He was wounded. But both the tattoo on his bald head and the scars at the corners of his eyes were telling me that he would not be afraid of a fight. I held the gun steady and pointed it at him when Lieutenant Kang casually said, "He's one of us." Lieutenant Kang was sitting on top of some passed-out lackey in a pink striped shirt. He was holding half of a cigarette in his hand and he had just exhaled a puff of murky white smoke. I was shocked. This person didn't look like a police officer at all. Well, I suppose they were all birds of a feather. Unit 4 must have plenty of weirdos like him, or like them. I lowered the gun, stood straight and gave him a salute. Sir, I'm Chang Yonmin. I was just assigned to Unit 4 a week ago. It's a pleasure to meet you. Pleasure to meet you too. It wasn't a hulking officer who had responded. It was Choi Yo-han, who was standing behind him with a gun pushed up against his head. Did you all think it was fucking over? He held his gun against the officer's temple while rubbing his own bruised head with the other hand. Crap. I had somehow forgotten that he had only been shot by a toy gun. How could I have made such an idiotic mistake again? Lieutenant Kang slowly stood up too. His cigarette was still burning, but he had no interest in smoking it again. Now those are the kinds of looks that I like. Kid, raise your gun. I wasn't sure what trick he was trying to play, but I involuntarily held onto it more firmly. I'm giving you two choices, your lieutenant or this meathead here. Use your gun to make your pick, put a bullet in his head, and then we're done. Don't play any tricks on me. What? I must have heard it wrong. I'd never been trained for this scenario back at the academy. Choi Yo-han chuckled. Oh, also, I'm the kind of person who doesn't have too much patience, so I'll give you 5 seconds. How about that? Let's begin the countdown. 5. I slowly raised the gun, while my arms suddenly felt like they'd been filled with lead. On one side it was the senior officer whom I had just met. On the other side it was Lieutenant Kang. What kind of sick joke was this? I must calm down and think. There must be some other way. But I had only 5 seconds. 4. Lieutenant Kang was standing to my right. The cigarette in his hand had already burned out. He was standing there completely motionless, like a statue. Our eyes met in midair, but time kept flowing. My hands were shaking. 3. I pointed my gun at Choi Yo-han. I tried my best to aim at his forehead. Could I make the shot? 2. The officer looked at me calmly. He seemed to be telling me with his eyes, I trust you, but I couldn't trust myself. 1. Huge drops of sweat were rolling down my face. No, I couldn't make it. I gave up. The officer's head exploded right in front of my eyes. Then the gun barrel turned to me with a sliver of smoke still creeping out of it. Troy pulled the trigger. The bullet hit me and knocked me over. Kang back, yeah. How does it feel, watching your men die in front of you? Huh? I felt my eyelids getting heavier and heavier. I couldn't see the expression on Lieutenant Kang's face. The voice of joy mocking and taunting the lieutenant was getting further and further away too. A few weeks later, I woke up in the Busan Metropolitan Hospital. Tubes were coming out of every part of my body. The EKG machine was beeping steadily next to the bed. Captain Gong told me when he visited me that I was the only survivor from the warehouse. How could this have happened? How many reasons do you want? Someone please tell me that this was all just a dream. Please, Buddha, they were all good people. Please help them. Chang Yonmin. I think it's about time that he realizes he's completely unsuitable for the job of a police officer. Maybe he can go into, traffic control. Do something like that. Alright. My dad had a bad temper. He often hit my mum and me. One day, I knocked him out with a bottle to help Mum. I thought he would beat me up once he woke up, but I never expected that people from a mental hospital would show up at our door. These strangers were here to take me away. Mum was not at home. I could still hear the last word they'd ever said to me. Bastard. I was not ill. I was taken to the hospital because I was a bad child. However, everybody here would insist they were not ill. Besides, the male nurses here were all as strong as bears. He could lift me off the ground with a single hand. There was no way I could escape from here. Looking at his figure, it doesn't require the strength of a bear to lift him up by one hand. I can definitely do that. I was put in a very small room alone. There was a desk, a chair, and a simple bed. The sheets and blankets looked yellow and they were covered with stains. The walls were very dirty too, and someone had written a lot of bad words in the corners. I would try to talk with the female nurses just to get through the day. Soon I realized that as long as I kept saying nice things about them, they would tell me anything I wanted to know. I had learned from them that the hospital was not too far away from my home. They said that the president of the hospital was a relative of someone important in the government. That was how the hospital had received a lot of government funding, but the president had pocketed most of it for himself. They also said that the president was rarely here. The person who was really in charge was the vice president, Dr. Lee Yun-suk. Dr. Lee was an expert in his field and he always looked out for the employees. If it weren't for him, the hospital would have closed down a long time ago. It was a Tuesday. I'd been here for 2 days, but I hadn't seen one doctor yet. If I could have Dr. Lee examine me, maybe he would know that I wasn't really ill and let me go home. Around dinner time, I was waiting for the tray to be put through the door when it opened. A tall, slim male nurse stood at the door and said he would take me to see the doctor. I had never seen him before. He probably worked in another building. I followed him downstairs across the garden and into another building. We walked up to the 5th floor and stopped at the door of an office. The name tag on the door said Lee Yun-suk. I sat nervously on the medical stool. It was very dark inside and no lights were turned on. I could smell a faint scent in the room. It was only the two of us in the room. He asked a few simple questions first. To prove I was a good child, I answered all of the questions honestly. I also told him that Dad would beat Mum and me and why I thought I had been brought here. It was because Dad thought I was a bastard, a bad child. You are here because you have a condition called selective cognitive impairment. Dr. Lee took off his white coat and laid it on the back of his chair. Selective cognitive impairment? I had never heard of it. I could barely say it. In other words, you have a tendency to fantasize about events. Ooh. For instance, you said your father had choked your mother with a rope, but that never happened. That's not true. Dad must have lied to you. He beat me. He even poured boiling water on me. I can show you. I took off my shirt and turned my back towards him. I showed him the burn scars that went from my neck all the way to my back. That was what Dad had given me when he doused me with boiling water. Dr. Lee raised his hand and touched the scars with his fingertips. His hand was so cold that I took a deep breath. You are mistaken. It wasn't your father who did this to you. Your symptoms are quite severe. If we don't do something about it, it might very likely turn into schizophrenia. A severe mental disorder, common symptoms including hearing and or seeing things that others do not perceive, memory confusion that leads to anxiety, paranoia, violent mood swings and more. This can eventually lead one to cause bodily harm to themselves and others. Patients with this disorder also have a higher suicide rate than normal. At the moment, the condition can be controlled by medication, but there is no known cure. Neither electroconvulsive therapy nor lobotomy are known to be effective. Schizophrenia could be developed from other mental disorders, such as selective cognitive impairment, a X-linked hereditary condition, which, if not controlled, could lead to schizophrenia. I turned around and saw Dr. Lee untying his tie. That would be an even worse condition. People with the condition have to be tied down to their beds. They can't go outside, not even to the bathroom. Every day they need to go through electroconvulsive therapy. In more serious cases, we might even perform brain surgery on them. Perhaps I was too frightened. I felt my entire body getting warm and my knees were becoming weak. Dr. Lee held me steady. Don't be afraid, kid. As long as you do everything I tell you, one day you will fully recover. Dr. Lee put his hands on my back, pushed me against his desk and pulled down my pants. He pressed himself against me and forced my legs open. I didn't want to stay, but for some reason I couldn't feel any strength in my arms or legs. I didn't know what he was going to do to me. I was so scared. Please, doctor, let me go. I could only beg him to let me go. He just laughed. Let you go? That's not going to happen. You're here because of a lot of money. Money? Suddenly an excruciating, splitting pain washed over my entire body. My brain stopped thinking. I couldn't hear anything he said afterwards. All I could hear was some deafening buzzing noises in my ear. A full-length mirror was hung on the wall on the right side of the room. I could see two pale bodies lit by the moonlight in the reflection. I raised my hand hoping that the smaller body in the reflection would turn out not to be me. But the person in the mirror whose face was crying and twisting in pain and despair slowly raised his hand too, just as I did. No. No. No, 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 no! The excruciating pain shooting through my back foiled my fear as I started to resist. I struggled to move my arms around, and pushed the files on the desk away, and then I felt something. A gun. Dr. Lee was sweating heavily and he didn't notice what I was doing. I put my index finger on the trigger and raised the gun, shaking uncontrollably. I turned to my right. I pulled the trigger. The mirror suddenly shattered into pieces and scattered all over the floor. Dr. Lee was extremely shocked. He twisted the gun out of my hand and threw it into the medical stool. The tall, slim nurse opened the door and peeked inside. But the moment he saw Dr. Lee shaking his head, he stepped back out again and closed the door. It was still just the two of us. Nothing had changed. Even though I had smashed the mirror and its reflected horrors to smithereens, nothing had changed. I saw numerous blue eyes in the broken pieces of the mirror. All of those eyes belonged to me. I was in the mirror. So who was the person that was outside of the mirror? I couldn't seem to recognize him. This yellow-haired and powerless child. Who was he? Park Sung-gun. Well, let me take a quick break here and I'll be right back. Okay, I'm back. I didn't realize this was the way they were taking this. I thought it would actually be very interesting, probably not the way they wanted it to go. But I would have liked if it was actually his imagination. Like if he was, I would have liked, that sounds horrible to say. But if he was actually mentally ill and he was just imagining all of these things. But, well, they wanted to take it this way, I guess. You're just killing him. That's fine. Let's try this. Oh no, we need him to pull the trigger, I think. Otherwise it's just not gonna go well. I pointed the gun at Lieutenant Kang. Was there really no other way? 2. Lieutenant Kang saw me pointing the gun at him. He didn't look like he blamed me. He seemed to be telling me with his eyes. I trust you. But I couldn't trust myself. Okay. Yep, this is what we've read before. He gives up. And then same thing happens again. Yep, that makes sense. Nothing's going to change here if I don't shoot, basically. But I wanted to know what happens in this story if he shoots. An enormous noise, louder than anything I'd ever heard, exploded from the gun. My entire arm felt numb after the shock, but I was still holding it in my hand. Then I felt something warm and red dripping on my chest. Dr. Lee was still smiling, but there was a hole in the middle of his forehead. I pushed him away and sat back up. He fell on the floor with his face up. He still had a hard-on. All of a sudden there seemed to be a lot of people hanging out in the hallway outside. I could hear footsteps, conversations, even screams. Shut up. I came down from the desk and walked to the mirror with my ears covered. My body still looked pale in the moonlight, but now there were some red stripes on it. It reminded me of the warriors that I had seen in the movies. In Russia, did people paint themselves with red stripes too? Okay. Alright. I can probably do yeah. Let's go with that. Which way around do I take these? Sure. Let's try this. Free. I pointed my gun at Choyohan. No, don't do that. Oh yeah, do that. Never mind, I mixed up the names. Sorry. I tried my best to aim at his forehead. Could I make the shot? 2. The officer looked at me calmly. Yeah, we've read through that. He trusts me. 1. Huge drops of sweat were rolling down my face when I pulled the trigger. The bullet flew out of the barrel and hit the officer's head. He's so incompetent. It exploded right in front of my eyes. Aren't you a funny kid? Why don't you consider joining us? Choyohan mocked me with his jokes and turned the gun to me. I was still paralyzed in shock. He pulled the trigger. Yep, and then it just all goes and does the same as before. If I killed him, I would become a murderer. Where would I be able to run if I became a murderer? I put down the gun. Tears of shame and pain streamed down my face. I decided that I would survive this. And then I swore to myself that I would find another chance. I swore. I didn't turn my head and I didn't close my eyes. I wanted to burn his evil face into my memory, along with the men who sold me for money. What you have done to me. One day I will pay you back, plus extra. Okay, so that's an S rank. So how do I get anything decent out of this? What about this? Yeah. My hands were shaking like never before. It reminded me of the only time that I had ever hit inside the target. Because his hands are shaking so much that he's incapable of aiming properly, so of course he hits. It was a very windy day and I was wearing nothing but a tank top, so I'd been trembling because of the cold. Now that I was shaking so much, maybe that would be another miracle. 2. The officer looked at me calmly. Yep. 1. Pulled the trigger. The bullet flew out of the barrel and just grazed Joy's hair. It might have been the closest shot I have ever made. Unfortunately, it was completely useless right now. The officer's head exploded right in front of my eyes. Yep. And we're back to square one again. Okay. Still bad. Actually, I never do this. There's nothing below here, right? No. What about this? Does that change anything? No. What if I just don't do anything here? Okay. Apparently still fine. Pointed the gun at Lieutenant Kang. Choyohan was not easy to fool. I had to choose the lieutenant in order to save the officer. As long as I didn't hit any critical spots, the lieutenant would be okay. I could also stall for a little longer. 2. Lieutenant Kang saw me pointing the gun at him. It didn't look like he blamed me. Yep. I could see that he had understood that it was my plan to stall. 1. Huge drops of sweat were rolling down my face when I pulled the trigger. The bullet flew out of the barrel towards Lieutenant Kang and hit the man lying behind him. The lackey in the pink striped shirt grunted and everything went quiet again. As expected, my terrible shooting had just made things worse. How dare you try to trick me? Let me show you the consequences. Choi Johan pulled the trigger with his finger. The officer's head exploded right in front of my eyes. Yep. Alright. We've only got like 2 more options. We'll get the right one eventually. Okay. Nope. Nope. There we go. That's an option that's apparently still possible.